In the transition from traditional to more modern forms of society, people in all the older civilizations have re examined their religious base. People in modern societies do not necessarily reject their ancestral religions. In fact, they may strongly reaffirm their religious beliefs, but they usually try also to adapt their religions to modern economic and political conditions and to make room for new and non religious interests. The process of developing various activities outside the sphere of religion is called secularization. Latin Christendom was the first of the world's major religious cultures to become increasingly secularized. In the very long run, it was those aspects of European civilization that were least associated with Christianity, such as natural science and industrial technology, or military and economic power, that the non European world proved to be most willing to adopt. This secularization of human cultures, although often challenged by popular religious movements in the contemporary world, remains one of the decisive trends in modern world history, and it is a trend that began to appear in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. The Europe that had become both expansive and more prosperous by the 13th century entered upon a series of new disasters over the following 2 centuries. The Mongols, after about 1240, held Russia in subjugation for 200 years. The Ottoman Turks, who had originated in Central Asia, penetrated the Byzantine Empire, crushed the medieval Serbian kingdom at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and spread over the Balkans. They took Constantinople itself in 1453. Eastern Christianity continued to exist, but under alien political domination. Latin Christianity, reaching from Poland and Hungary to the Atlantic, remained independent but was beset with troubles. The authority of the papacy and of the Roman Catholic Church was called into question. Eventually, new Protestant churches emerged, and the religious unity of medieval Christian civilization disappeared. 53 yet new forces also asserted themselves alongside or outside the religious tradition. Government, law, philosophy, science, the arts, material interests, and economic activities were pursued with less regard for older 143 Christian values. Power, order, beauty, wealth, knowledge, and control of nature were regarded as desirable in themselves. In this mixture of decline and revival, of religious revolution and secularization, medieval Christendom evolved into the social, political, and cultural world of early modern Europe. 5. Disasters of the 14th century. The Black Death and its consequences. During the 14th century, and quite abruptly, about a third of the population of Europe was wiped out. Although it is impossible to know exactly how many people lived in medieval Europe, modern demographic historians have estimated that the total population fell from more than 80 million in the early 1300s to roughly 60 million in 1400, and Europe's population did not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century. See the graph on P55. Some died in sporadic local famines that began to appear after 1300. The great killer, however, was the plague, or Black Death, which first struck Europe in 1348. The precise medical cause of the plague is still debated. Most modern historians believe that the disease was carried by rats and transmitted by fleas, but this theory may not explain how the contagion moved so quickly across Europe or why so many humans became vulnerable to a bacillus that normally lives in rodents. A pneumonic form of the plague, which caused severe lung infections, also spread quickly through coughs or other human contacts. Despite the uncertainty about its physiological origins, historians agree that the plague caused painful lymphatic swelling, intense fevers, and other lethal effects in almost everyone who fell ill. It also had decisive effects on European social life. Since the plague returned at irregular and unpredictable intervals and killed off the young as well as the old, it disrupted marriage and family life and made it impossible for many years for Europe to regain the former level of population. In some places, whole villages disappeared. Cultivated fields were abandoned for want of able bodied men and women to work them. The towns were especially 144 vulnerable because the contagion spread quickly through populations crowded within town walls. Trade and exchange were obstructed. Prices, wages, and incomes moved erratically. Famine made its victims more susceptible to disease, and deaths from the plague contributed to famine. The living were preoccupied with the burial of the dead and with fears for their own future. The Black Death. There were immediate social and political repercussions. In some cases, survivors benefited because the scarcity of labor led to higher wages. On the other hand, in the general disorganization, and with landowners and urban employers decimated also, many of the poor could find no work or took to vagabondage and begging. The upper classes, acting through governments, attempted to control wages and prices. Rebellions of workers broke out in various towns, especially in Flanders, and there were massive insurrections of peasants in many parts of Europe. In France, these were called jacqueries, from Jacques, a nickname for a peasant, of which the first was in 1358. In England, a similar large-scale uprising in 1381 came to be known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion. Sometimes the spokesmen for these movements went beyond their immediate grievances to raise broader social 54 questions about why some should be rich and others poor. Governments and the upper classes replied to this menace with ferocious repression. The peasants generally returned to their usual labors. Yet something was gained for the rural workers, at least in the long run, as underlying economic and demographic forces continued to assert themselves. The landowners, or feudal class, in order to get the work done on their manors and assure their own incomes, had to offer more favorable terms. These included, for example, the giving of lifetime tenures to peasant families in return for fixed payment of sums of money. Over the years, many of these peasant holdings became hereditary, and the value of money decreased, so that payment of a shilling, for example, which in 1400 represented a 145 significant amount, became much less burdensome for the rural worker by 1600. In effect, a class of small peasant property owners began to emerge in much of Europe. Revolts and repression. This graph shows the growth of Europe's population after 1200, the far-reaching demographic impact of the Black Death in the 14th century, and the gradual revival of the European population during the 15th century. Source: Massimo Livi Bacci, A Concise History of World Population, 5th ed. Oxford, Wiley Blackwell, 2012. The kings, who had been building up their position against the church and the feudal lords since the 11th century, also found their problems complicated by the disasters of the 14th. They still had their governments to maintain and their ambitions to satisfy, even if death removed large fractions of their subjects. They even had to increase their incomes, as it became usual for kings to employ royal armies of foot soldiers against the recurring possibility of feudal resistance. Various means of increasing the royal spending power were devised. Currency was debased. That is, the king ordered a given weight of gold or silver to represent a larger number of monetary units. Thus, he temporarily had more money, but the result was inflation and higher prices, which led to further declines in the value of money. New taxes were introduced. About 1300, the kings of both England and France undertook to tax the landowning clergy of their respective kingdoms. The kings made 146 increasing demands as well on great noble landholders and urban merchants. These demands were resisted or made subject to bargains by the representative bodies, whose origin was described in the last chapter, so that the 14th century, and still more the 15th, has been called the golden age of the medieval parliaments. 55 and 1337, the Hundred Years' War began between England and France. The war grew out of a dynastic struggle between English and French rulers, who both claimed the right to be king of France, but the war between their royal families continued long after the first claimants had died. The battles all took place in France, which was internally divided, some parts, like Aquitaine, having long belonged to the English crown. France was ravaged by marauding bands of English soldiers and their French adherents. Eventually, however, French forces began to achieve military victories under the inspired leadership of Joan of Arc, the young woman whom the English burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431 after she was convicted by the Church of heresy and witchcraft. The war finally ended in 1453 when the English lost a final decisive battle and gave up their long campaign to control territories on the continent. But the French suffered the greatest human and material losses during the many decades of fighting and social disruption. The costly century of warfare also had important consequences in England, where a kind of early patriotism arose among the English as their soldiers used longbows to defeat the mounted French knights at places such as Agincourt. Parliament widened its powers because the kings needed money for their campaigns. But the great English barons also became more unruly, and internal disorders fractured England throughout the 15th century. Dukes and earls and their followers formed private armies and fought with each other. They defied the royal law courts and intimidated juries, used parliament and government for their own purposes, and exploited their peasants. From about 1450 until 1485, England was beset by upper-class turmoil that came to be called the Wars of the Roses, because the opposing noble factions adopted red and white roses as their symbols. The 147, the Hundred Years' War troubles of the medieval church. Meanwhile, similar calamities afflicted the church. In 1300, the Church of the High Middle Ages, centralized in the papacy, stood at its zenith. But the church was weakened by its very successes. It faced the danger that besets every successful institution, a form of government or a university, to choose modern examples. The danger of believing that the institution exists for the benefit of those who conduct its affairs. The papacy, being at the top, was the most liable to this danger. It became corrupt, set in its ways, out of touch with public opinion, and controlled by a self-perpetuating bureaucracy. It was unable to reform itself and unwilling to let anyone else reform it. Both Edward I of England and Philip the Fair of France in the 1290s assessed taxes on the landed estates belonging to the great abbeys, bishoprics, and other components of the church. The Pope, Boniface VIII, prohibited the taxation of clergy by the civil ruler. In the ensuing altercation in 1302, he issued the famous bull Unam Sanctum, the most extreme of all assertions of papal supremacy, which declared that outside the Roman Church there was no salvation, and that every human creature was subject to the Roman pontiff. The French king sent soldiers to arrest Boniface, who soon died. French influence in the College of Cardinals brought about the election of a pope who was expected to be subservient to King Philip, and who took up his residence with his court and officials at Avignon on the lower Rhone River, on what were then the borders of France. Thus began 56 the Babylonian captivity of the church. The rest of Europe regarded the popes at Avignon throughout the century as tools of the French monarchy, and the papacy lost much of its prestige as a universal institution. The Babylonian captivity, 48 attempts to correct the situation, made matters worse. In 1378, the College of Cardinals, torn by French and anti-French factions within it, elected two popes, Both were equally legitimate, being chosen by cardinals, but one lived at Rome, one at Avignon, and neither would resign. The French and their supporters recognized the Avignon Pope, England and most of Germany, the Roman. For 40 years, both lines were perpetuated. There were now two papacies, estranged by the Great Schism of the West. Never had the papacy been so externally magnificent as in the days of the captivity and the schism. The papal court at Avignon surpassed the courts of kings in splendor. The papal officialdom grew in numbers, ignoring the deeper problems while busily transacting each day's business. Papal revenues mounted, and new papal taxes were devised. In the continuing movement of funds from all over Europe to the papal court, from the 13th century on, a new class of international bankers rose and prospered, the Great Schism. But the papacy, never so sumptuous, had never since the 10th century rested on such shaky foundations. People pay willingly for institutions in which they believe and admire magnificence in leaders whom they respect. But before 1378, with the Pope submissive to France, and after 1378, with two popes and two papacies to support, there was growing complaint at the extravagance and worldliness of papal rule. It must be remembered that all this happened in a Europe traumatized by the plague, and with a declining number of people expected to bear increasing financial burdens. The most pious Christians were the most shocked. They recognized the vital necessity of obtaining God's grace. But with two churches under two popes, each claiming to hold the keys to heaven from Peter, how could they be certain that their church gave true salvation? In a society that was still primarily a religious community, this sense of religious insecurity was a source of uneasiness and dread. 1 in 49. The old moorings were weakened. The wrath of God seemed to be raining upon the earth, and no one knew how to escape from the crisis. Symptoms of mass neurosis appeared. Some people sought refuge in a hectic merriment or luxury and self-indulgence. Others became preoccupied with grisly subjects. Some frantically performed the dance of death in the cemeteries, while others furtively celebrated the Black Mass, parodying religion in a mad desire to appease the devil. The Order of Flagellants grew up. Its members went through the streets, two by two, beating each other with chains and whips. Religious anxieties and fearful religious rumors contributed also to waves of anti-Jewish violence, murder, and expulsion that spread across parts of France and Germany in the 14th century. And it was at this time that people first became obsessed with the fear of witches, a delusion that would ultimately cause thousands of persons, often older women, to be tortured and executed over the following 3 centuries. Responses to crisis, disaffection with the church, or the thought that it might not be the true or the only way to salvation, spread in all ranks of society. It was not only kings who disputed the claims of the clergy, but also obscure parish priests, close to the distress of ordinary people, who began to doubt the powers of their ecclesiastical superiors. One of these humble clerics was William Langland, who in his Piers Plowman in the 1360s contrasted the sufferings of the honest poor with the hypocrisy and corruption in high places. Such unsettling ideas spread very widely. In England, those who held them were known as Lollards. Since the actual poor left no records, it is hard to say exactly what they thought, but some of their ideas were probably 57 expressed by John Wycliffe, who taught at Oxford. About 1380, Wycliffe was saying that the true church could do without elaborate possessions, and even that an organized church might not be necessary for salvation, since ordinary devout persons could do without priests and obtain salvation by 150 reading the Bible, which he translated into English. Similar ideas appeared in Bohemia in Central Europe, with Jan Hus as their spokesman. Here they became a national movement, for the Hussites were both a religious party and at the same time a Slavic or Czech party, protesting against the supremacy of the Germans who lived in Bohemia. The Hussite Wars ravaged Central Europe for decades in the 15th century. The ideas of the Lollards and of Huss and Wycliffe were branded as heresy, or unacceptable deviations from the true doctrine of the Church. Lollards and Hussites' extreme expressions of religious anxiety appeared in the later Middle Ages among the flagellants who wandered through towns beating themselves to appease the wrath of God. They are portrayed here in a later 16th century engraving of their processions. Bridgman Giordon, Art Resource. Why? Influential and established persons did not yet turn to heresy, and still less to witchcraft or flagellation. Their answer to the needs of the day was to assemble a great Europe-wide or general council of the Church, in 151 which reforms could be pressed by the whole body of Christians upon the reluctant and rival popes. The conciliar movement in 1409, such a church council met at Pisa. All parts of the divided Roman Catholic Church were represented. The council declared both reigning popes deposed and obtained the due election of another, but since the first two refused to resign, there were now three. In 1414, an even greater and more fully attended council met at Constance. Its aims were three: to 58 end the now threefold schism, to extirpate heresy, and to reform the church in head and members, or from top to bottom. Not much was accomplished in reform. To discourage heresy, Jan Hus was interrogated, condemned, and burned at the stake. The schism was ended. All three popes were at last persuaded or compelled to withdraw, and another, Martin V, was elected. The unity of the church under the papacy was at last restored. The majority of the Council of Constance wished to make general councils part of the permanent apparatus of the church. Martin V, however, soon reaffirmed the prerogatives of the papal office, dissolved the Council of Constance, repudiated its decrees, and reestablished papal authority in Rome. The next 30 years saw a continuing contest of wills between successive popes and successive councils, general councils. In this battle for jurisdiction, few reforms could be adopted, and fewer still could be enforced. Increasingly, the life of the church was corrupted by money. No one believed in bribery, but everyone knew that many high churchmen, like many high civil officials of the day, could be bribed. To buy or sell a church office was a crime in the canon law known as simony, but it was a crime that in the 15th century could not be 152 suppressed. For churchmen to live with mistresses was considered understandable, if unseemly. The standards of laymen in such matters were not high. But for a bishop or other ecclesiastic to give lucrative church positions to his own children or other relatives was the abuse known as nepotism, and it too could not be eradicated. To sell divine grace for money, all agreed, was not only wrong but also impossible. But in 1300, Boniface VIII had given encouragement to the practice of indulgences. A person, if properly confessed, absolved, and truly repentant, might, by obtaining an indulgence, be spared certain of the temporal punishments of purgatory. One usually obtained such an indulgence in return for a donation of money. The practice proved to be a fatally easy method of fundraising, despite complaints against the sale of indulgences simply for money. Church corruption and indulgences. Gradually, the popes prevailed over the councils. The conciliar movement was greatly weakened for Christendom as a whole when the powerful French element secured its own independence after 1438 by a special arrangement in which the Gallican, or French, church declared its administrative independence from the Holy See, suppressed the payment of some church taxes to Rome, and forbade papal intervention in the appointment of French prelates. The papacy thus lost influence in France, but the popes remained preeminent in Europe as a whole. In 1449, with the dissolution of the Council of Basel, the conciliar movement came to an end. In 1450, a great jubilee was held in Rome to celebrate the papal triumph. The papacy, its prestige and freedom of action thus secured, now passed into the hands of a series of cultivated gentlemen, men of the world and men in tune with the evolving cultural values of their times, the famous popes of the Renaissance. Some, like Nicholas V, 1447-1455, or Pius II, 1458-1464, were accomplished scholars and connoisseurs of books. Some were like Innocent VIII, 1484-1492, a pleasant man who was the first pope to dine in public with ladies. Alexander VI, 1492, 1531-1503, of the Spanish Borgia family, exploited his office for the benefit of his relatives, trying to make his son Cesare Borgia the ruler of all Italy, while his daughter, Lucretia Borgia, became Duchess of Ferrara and gathered literary men and artists at her famous Renaissance court. Alexander VI's successor, Julius II, 1503-1513, was a capable general, and Leo X, 1513-1521, was a superb patron of architects and painters. But we must now describe the Italian Renaissance, in which worthies of this kind were elevated to the Holy See. The Renaissance Popes 59-6, the Renaissance in Italy. In Italy in the 15th century, and especially at Florence, we observe not merely a decay of medieval certainties, but the appearance of a new and invigorating attitude toward the world. The Renaissance, a French word meaning rebirth, received its historical name in the 19th century from those who thought of the Middle Ages as a dark time from which the human spirit had to be awakened. It was called a rebirth because of the belief that people in Italy, after a long interruption, had taken up and resumed a civilization like that of the Greco-Romans. Medieval people had thought of the times of Aristotle or Cicero as not sharply distinct from their own. In the Renaissance, with a new historical sense, arose the conception of modern and ancient times, separated by a long period with a different lifestyle and appropriately called the Middle Ages. The basic institutions of Europe, the distinctive languages and national cultures, the great frameworks of collective action in law, government, and economic production, all originated in the Middle Ages. But the Renaissance marked a new era in thought and feeling, by which Europe and its institutions were in the long run to be transformed. The origins of modern natural science can be traced more to the medieval universities at 154th and to the Renaissance thinkers. But it was in the Italy of the Quattrocento, as Italians call the 15th century, that other fields of thought and cultural expression were first cultivated. The Italian cultural influence in other countries remained very strong for at least 200 years. It pertained to high culture, and hence to a limited number of persons, but extended over the whole area represented by literature and the arts. Literature meaning all kinds of writing, and the arts, including all products of human skill. The effects of the Italian Renaissance, though much modified with the passage of time, were evident in the books and later art galleries of Europe and America and in the architecture of their cities, even after the revolution of modern art in the early 20th century. They involved the whole area of culture that was neither theological nor scientific, but concerned with moral and civic questions about what human beings ought to be or ought to do, with the answers reflected in matters of taste, style, propriety, decorum, personal character, and education. In particular, it was in Renaissance Italy that an almost purely secular attitude first appeared, in which leading thinkers no longer viewed life as a brief preparation for the hereafter. The Italian influence, the Italian cities, and the new conception of life. The towns of Italy, so long as long distance trade converged in the Mediterranean, were the biggest and most bustling of all the towns that rose in Europe during the Middle Ages. The crafts of Italy included many refined trades, such as those of the goldsmith or stonecarver, which were so zealously pursued that artisanship turned into art, and a delight in the beautiful became common among all classes. Merchants made fortunes in commerce. They lent their money to popes or princes and so made further fortunes as bankers. They bought the wares of the craftsmen, artists. They rejoiced not so much in money or the making of money as in the 155 beautiful things and psychological satisfactions that money could buy. And if they forgot the things that money could not buy, this is only to say again that their outlook was becoming more secular. The Italian towns were independent city states. There was no king to build up a government for Italy as a whole, and for several generations the popes were either absent at Avignon or engaged in disputes arising from the Great Schism, so that the influence of Rome was unimportant. 60. The merchant oligarchies, each in its own city, enjoyed an unhampered stage on which they could use their money to pursue interests other than those of business. In some, as at Milan, they succumbed to or worked with a local prince or despot. In others, as at Florence, Venice, and Genoa, they continued to govern themselves as republics. They had the experience of contending for public office, of suppressing popular revolt or winning popular favor, of producing works of public munificence, of making alliances, hiring armies, outwitting rivals, and conducting affairs of state. In short, Italy offered a social environment in which human personalities could develop in many secular directions. The Italian city states 156, the wealthiest persons in Italian towns, were often bankers who made money from the kind of financial exchange that is portrayed in this 15th century illustration. Scala Art Resource, NY. All this was especially true in Florence, the chief city of Tuscany, which had grown wealthy in the later Middle Ages from the production of woolens. In the 15th century, it had a population of about 60,000, which made it only moderately large as Italian cities went. Yet, like ancient Athens, Florence produced an extraordinary sequence of gifted individuals, from the years of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, who all died before 1375, to those of Machiavelli, who lived until 1527. An amazing number of the leading figures of the Italian Renaissance were Florentines. Like Athens also, Florence lost its republican liberty as well as its creative powers. Its history can be summarized in that of the Medici family. The founder of the family fortunes was Giovanni 1360 to 1429, a merchant and banker of Florence. His son, Cosimo de' Medici 1389 to 1464, allying himself with the popular element against some of the leading families of the Republic, soon became unofficial ruler himself. Cosimo's 61 grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, 1449 to 1492, also used his great wealth to govern, but is chiefly remembered as a poet, connoisseur, and lavish benefactor of art and learning. In the next century, Tuscany became a grand duchy, of which the Medici were hereditary grand dukes until the family died out in 1737. Thus established, they furnished numerous cardinals and two popes to the church, and two Medici women became queens of France. The Medici family, 57. Two wool merchants display their goods in bags of wool. This illustration, which is from a 1492 book on arithmetic, shows the use of both Arabic and Roman numerals. Bibliotheca Ricardiana, Florence Art Resource, NY. What arose in Italy in these surroundings was a new, more secular conception of life. It seemed very doubtful to many Italians that a quiet, cloistered, or celibate life was on a higher plane than an active, gregarious life, or family life, or even a life of promiscuity and adventure. It was hard to believe that clergy were any better than laity, or that life led to a stern divine judgment in the end. That human will and intelligence might prove misleading seemed a gloomy doctrine. The belief that human beings were frail creatures in need of God's grace and salvation, though perhaps said aloud and in public places, seemed to evoke less feeling in the heart. Instead, what captivated the Italians of the Renaissance was a sense of the vast range of human powers, a secular conception of life felt then. Formerly, the ideal behavior had been seen in renunciation, in a certain disdain for the concerns of this world. Now a life of public involvement was also prized. Formerly, poverty had been greatly respected, at least in Christian doctrine. Now there was more praise for a proper enjoyment of wealth. Medieval Europeans had admired a life of contemplation or meditative withdrawal. Now, the humanist Leonardo Bruni could write in 1433, "The whole glory of man lies in activity." Often, to be sure, the two attitudes existed in the same person. Sometimes 158 they divided different groups within the same city. As always, the old persisted along with the new. The result might be psychological stress and civil conflict. The new esteem for human activity took both a social and an individualistic turn. In cities maintaining their republican forms, as at Florence in the early 15th century, a new civic consciousness or sense of public duty was expressed. For this purpose, the writings of Cicero and other 62 ancients were found to be highly relevant, since they provided an ethics independent of the Christian and medieval tradition. There was also a kind of cult of the great individual, hardly known to the ancients, which gave little attention to collective responsibility. Renaissance individualism emphasized the outstanding attainments of extraordinary men. Women, by contrast, were usually expected to pursue the ordinary tasks of domestic life. The great man shaped his own destiny in a world governed by fortune. He had virtù, the quality of being a man, vir man, and although a few women might also exhibit virtù, It was a quality that in the society of the day was more to be expected in the most aggressive adult males. It meant the successful demonstration of human powers. A man of virtue in the arts, in war, or in statecraft was a man who knew what he was doing, who, from resources within himself, made the best use of his opportunities, hewing his way through the world and excelling in all that he did. For the arts, such a spirit is preserved in the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. Individualism 159, this procession is part of a fresco that Benozzo Gozzoli painted in 1469 for a Medici chapel. Although its title refers to the three kings on their way to Bethlehem, it actually represents important personages in 15th century Florence. Cosimo de' Medici is on a white horse, followed by a throng of supporters. Alinari Art Resource, NY. The growing preoccupation with human actions can be traced in new forms of painting, sculpture, and architecture that arose in Italy at this time. These arts, likewise, 63, reflected an increasing this worldliness, a new sense of reality and a new sense of space that was different from that of the Middle Ages and would underlie much European thought until the early 20th century. Space was no longer indeterminate, unknowable, or divine. It was a zone occupied by physical human beings. Reality meant visible and tangible persons or objects in this physical space, objective, in the sense that they looked or felt the same to all normal persons who perceived them. It was a function of the arts to convey this reality, however idealized or suffused by the artist's individual feeling, in such a way that observers could recognize in the image the identity of the subject portrayed. Despite the growing emphasis on individual achievements, knowledge itself was understood to be more than a subjective perception or the unique vision of a creative genius. 160, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, was a Florentine political leader whose famous patronage of the arts helped to give Florence its prominence in Renaissance painting, architecture, and sculpture. This bust of Lorenzo, likely based on a model by the late 15th century artists Andrea del Verrocchio and Orsino Benintendi, exemplifies the era's interest in portraying worldly power and human achievements. Source: National Gallery of Art. Architecture reflected the new tendencies. Although the Gothic cathedral at Milan was built as late as 1386, at Florence and elsewhere, architects preferred to adapt Greco-Roman principles of design, such as the classical column, the arch, and the dome. More public buildings of a non-religious character were built, and more substantial townhouses were put up by wealthy merchants, in styles meant to represent grandeur, or civic importance, or availability and convenience for human use. Gardens and terraces were added to many such buildings. Sculpture, confined in the Middle Ages to the niches and portals of cathedrals, now emerged as an independent and freestanding art. Its favored subjects were human beings, now presented so that the viewer could walk around the object and see it from all directions. The difference 161 from the religious figures carved on medieval churches was very great. Like the architects, Renaissance sculptors found much in the Greek and Roman tradition that was 64 modern and useful to their purpose. They produced portrait busts of eminent contemporaries or figures of great leaders, sometimes on horseback, or statues depicting characters from Greco-Roman history and mythology. The use of the nude in mythological or allegorical subjects likewise showed a conception of humanity that was more in keeping with the Greek than with the Christian tradition. Realism in sculpture and painting. Painting was less influenced by the ancients since the little of ancient painting that had survived was unknown during the Renaissance. The invention of painting in oils opened new pathways for the art. Merchants, ecclesiastics, and princes provided a mounting demand for portraits and new interpretations of biblical or ancient events. In subject matter, painting remained conservative, dealing most often with religious themes. It was the conception and presentation that were new. The new feeling for space became evident. 65. With the discovery of the mathematics of perspective, space was presented in exact relation to the beholder's eye. The viewer, in a sense, entered into the world of the painting. A three-dimensional effect was achieved with careful representation of distance through variation of size and techniques of shading or chiaroscuro added to the illusion of physical volume. Human figures were often placed in a setting of painted architecture, or against a background of landscape or scenery, showing castles or hills, which, though supposedly far away, yet framed the composition with a knowable boundary. In such a painting, everything was localized in place and time. A part of the real world was caught and put in the picture. The artistic aspiration was not to suggest eternity or 162 transcendent ideas, as in earlier religious painting, nor yet to express private fantasy or the workings of the unconscious, as in much modern art, but to present a familiar theme in an understandable setting, often with a narrative content, that is, by the telling of a story. Le Pieta by Michelangelo Buonarroti, Italian, 1475 to 1564. Michelangelo's marble representation of Mary with the body of Jesus shows the carefully crafted details of Renaissance Italian sculpture and fuses religious themes with the material depiction of human beauty and suffering. Shutterstock. Like the sculptors, painters studied human anatomy and also portrayed people in distinctive and living attitudes. Faces took on more expression as artists sought to depict individual personalities. Painting became less symbolic, less an intimation of general or abstract truths, more a portrayal of concrete realities as they met the eye. In Giovanni Bellini's portrait of a condottiere, P67, for example, the reader can see how a strong, real, and vivid personality looks out from the canvas. Similarly, the great religious paintings were peopled with human beings. In Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, Christ and his disciples are seen as a group of 163 men, each with his own characteristics. Raphael's Madonnas seem to be young Italian women, and in the mighty figures of Michelangelo, the attributes of humanity invade heaven itself. Humanism, the birth of literature. The literary movement in Renaissance Italy is called humanism because of the rising interest in humane letters, literae humaniores. There had indeed been much writing in the later Middle Ages. Much of it had been of a technical character, as in theology, philosophy, or law. Some of it had been meant to convey information, as in chronicles, histories, and descriptions of the physical world. Great hymns had been composed, lively student songs had been sung at the universities, plays had been performed in cathedrals, and the Old English and French legends of King Arthur and Roland had been written down. Troubadours had praised the wonders of true love. Yet a new kind of literature and literary culture began to appear in the 14th and 15th centuries in Italy. A new class of writers looked upon literature as their main life's work, wrote for each other and for a somewhat larger public, and used writing to deal with general questions, to examine their own states of mind, or to resolve their own difficulties. They used words to achieve artistic effects, or simply to please and amuse their readers. Almost all of the writers were men, but a few women also entered the new literary culture and contributed to the era's expanding literary themes. The writings of Christine de Pizan, for example, helped to spread humanist ideas in France during the early 15th century. Her family had moved to France from Italy, and also demonstrated to skeptical male critics that women could participate in the debates of European intellectual life. The Italian humanists, like their medieval predecessors, often wrote in Latin. They differed from earlier literate persons, however, in that they were usually not members of the clergy. They complained that Latin had become monkish, barbaric, and scholastic, a jargon of the schools and universities, and they greatly preferred the classic style of Cicero or Livy. Medieval Latin was a vigorous living language that used words in new senses, many of which have passed 16466 into English and the Romance languages as perfectly normal expressions. Yet, in the ancient writers, the humanists found qualities that medieval writing did not have. They discovered a new range of interests, a new sensibility, a complex discussion of political and civic questions, a world presented without the overarching framework of religious belief. In addition, the Greeks and Romans unquestionably had style, a sense of form, a taste for the elegant and the epigrammatic. They had also written many of their works for practical ends in dialogues, orations, or treatises that were designed for purposes of persuasion. Humanists and Latin Portrait of a Condottiere by Giovanni Bellini, Italian, 1430 to 1516. This portrait provides an emphatic statement of Renaissance individualism. The artist represents here a concrete, strong willed human being rather than an abstract type, stressing his subject's independence and self sufficiency by placing him against a dark and entirely vacant background. Source National Gallery of Art, 165. If the humanists therefore made a cult of antiquity, it was because they saw kindred spirits in ancient cultures. They sensed a thematic relevance for their own time. The classical influence, never wholly absent in the Middle Ages, now re entered as a main force in the higher culture of European writers. The humanists polished their Latin, and increasingly they learned Greek. They searched assiduously for classical texts hitherto unknown. Many were found. They had, of course, been copied and preserved by the monks of an earlier era. But while a special dignity attached to writing in Latin, known throughout Europe, most of the humanists wrote in Italian also. Or rather, they used the mode of speech current in Florence. This had also been the language of Dante's early 14th century epic poem, The Divine Comedy. To this vast poem, the humanists now added many writings in Florentine or Tuscan prose. The result was that Florentine became the standard form of modern Italian. It was the first 67 time that a European vernacular, that is, the common spoken tongue as opposed to Latin, became thus standardized amid the variety of its dialects and adapted in structure and vocabulary to the more formal requirements of a written language. French and English soon followed, and most of the other European languages somewhat later. Vernacular languages. The Florentine exile Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, has been called the first man of letters. The son of a merchant who had moved to the papal city of Avignon, Petrarch spent his life in travel throughout France and Italy. Although he trained for the law and was ordained as a clergyman, he became a somewhat rootless critic of these teamed professions, which he denounced for their scholasticism. He lived in the generation after Dante, dying in 1374, and he anticipated the more fully developed humanism that was to come. His voluminous writings show the complex, contradictory attitudes of early Renaissance thought. Attracted by life, love, beauty, travel, and connections with people of importance in 66 church and state, he could also spurn all these things as ephemeral and deceptive. He loved Cicero for his common sense and his commitment to political liberty. Indeed, he discovered a manuscript of Cicero's letters in 1345. He loved St. Augustine for his otherworldly vision of the city of God. But in Cicero's writings, he also found a deep religious concern, and in St. Augustine, he esteemed the active man who had been a bishop and writer, heavily engaged in the controversies of his time. Petrarch. Petrarch wrote sonnets in Italian, an epic in Latin, an introspective study of himself, and a great many letters that he clearly meant to be literary productions. He aspired to literary fame. In all this, we see a new kind of writer who uses language not merely as a practical tool, but as a medium of more subtle expression to commune with himself, to convey moods of discouragement or satisfaction, to clarify doubts, to improve his own understanding of the choices and options that life affords. With Petrarch, in short, literature became a kind of calling and also a consideration of moral philosophy, still related but no longer subordinate to religion. It was moral philosophy in the widest sense, raising questions of how human beings should adjust to the world, what a good life ought to be, and where the ultimate rewards of living were to be found. Petrarch was an indication of things to come. Boccaccio, his contemporary and also a Florentine, wrote the Decameron in Italian, a series of tales designed both to entertain and to impart a certain wisdom about human character and behavior. They were followed by the main group of humanists, far more numerous but less well remembered. Men of letters began to take part in public life, to gather students and found schools, to serve as secretaries to governing bodies or princes, and even to occupy office themselves. Thus, the humanist Coluccio Salutati became Chancellor of Florence in 1375. During the following decades, Florence was threatened by the expansive ambitions of Milan, where the princely despotism of the Visconti family controlled the city-state. Against such dangers, a new and intense Florentine civic consciousness asserted itself. 1607 Salutati, in addition to the usual duties of chancellor, served the state with his pen, glorifying Florentine liberty and identifying it with the liberties of ancient republican Rome before they were undermined by the Caesars. Another humanist, Leonardo Bruni, later succeeded him as chancellor. Bruni wrote a history of Florence that marked a new achievement in historical writing when compared with the annals and chronicles of the Middle Ages. He saw the past as clearly different from but relevant to the present, and he introduced a new division of historical periods. On the model of such ancient writers as Livy, he adopted a flowing narrative form, and he used history for a practical political purpose to show that Florence had a long tradition of liberty and possessed values and 68 attainments worth fighting for against menacing neighbors. History became a new kind of useful knowledge. It took on a public value that it had once had for the Greeks and Romans, and that it would retain in the future in Europe and eventually in other parts of the world. The function of heightening a sentiment, not yet of nationalism, but of collective civic consciousness or group identity. It was meant to arouse its readers to a life of commitment and public participation. The Humanists 168. The three men in this painting were Florentine humanists around 1490. They appear in a larger work that the artist Domenico Ghirlandaio painted for a chapel. Ghirlandaio followed the typical Renaissance practice of using religious stories or events to convey secular subjects and ideas. Alinari Art Resource. All this literary activity was of a scholarly type, in which authors broadened their understanding as much by reading as by personal experience of the world. And scholarly activity, the habit of attending closely to what a page really said, had consequences that went beyond either pure literature or local patriotism. A new critical attitude developed. Bruni, in his history, showed a new analytical sense of the need for authentic sources. Lorenzo Valla became one of the founders of textual criticism. Studying the Latin language historically, he observed that its characteristic words and expressions varied from one time to another. He put this knowledge to the service of the King of Naples in a dispute with the Pope. Valla showed, by analysis of the language used in the document, that the donation of Constantine, on which the papacy then based its temporal claims, could not have been written in Constantine's time in the 4th century, and so was a forgery. Such scholarship helped establish modern methods for assessing the truth of written texts, and it contributed also to humanist optimism about the range and utility of human knowledge. Pico della Mirandola and others looked for aspects of truth not revealed in the Christian scriptures. In 1486, the enthusiastic and very learned Pico, for example, claimed at the age of 23 that he could summarize all human knowledge in 900 theses, which he had drawn from the Chaldaic, Arabic, Hebrew, Grecian, Egyptian, and Latin sages. Modern Critical Methods, 69 Schooling, Manners, and Family Life, 1169. While Italian humanism thus contributed new themes, vernacular texts, and analytical methods to literature and scholarship, to classical learning, and to the formation of modern national languages, it also had tangible and lasting effects in education. Here, its impact persisted in all European cultures down to the present. The medieval universities were essentially places for professional training in theology, medicine, and law. Except in England, this continued to be their primary function. What came to be known as secondary education, the preparation of young men either for the universities or for life, owes more to the Renaissance. The organized education of women came much later. Some girls learned to read at home or in one of the few female primary schools, but young women were excluded from humanist academies and Renaissance universities. Medieval schooling had been chaotic and repetitious. Young male students of all ages sat together with a teacher, each absorbing from the confusion whatever could be understood of Latin rules and vocabulary. The Renaissance launched the idea of putting different age groups or levels of accomplishment into separate classes, in separate rooms, each with its own teacher, with periodic promotion of the pupil from one level to the next. Latin remained the principal subject, with Greek now added. But many new purposes were seen in the study of Latin. It was intended to give skill in the use of language, including the pupil's native tongue. Rhetoric was the art of using language to influence others. It heightened communication. Knowledge alone was not enough, said the historian and Chancellor Bruni, who also wrote a short work on education. To make effectual use of what we know, we must add the power of expression. Nor was Latin merely the necessary professional tool for the priest, the physician, the lawyer, or the government servant. The student learned Latin and Greek in order to read the ancient writings, epics, lyrics, orations, letters, histories, dialogues, and philosophical treatises. And it was assumed that such writings offered practical lessons for the educated elites of every generation. Readers therefore learned how to find relevant historical models or failures in the rise and decline of the Roman Republic and the troubles of the Greek city states. The classics were meant also to have a moral impact, to produce a balanced personality, and to form character. Not everyone could be important or gifted, said the humanist 170 Vitorino, but we all face a life of social duty and are responsible for our personal influence on others. This emphasis on character formation became a permanent theme in the educational systems that trained the young men of early modern Europe. Renaissance education. Young people were trained also for a more civilized deportment in everyday social living. Personal style in the upper classes became somewhat more studied. Hitherto, Europeans had generally acted like big children. They spat, belched, and blew their noses without inhibition, snatched at food with their fingers, bawled at each other when they were unhappy, or sulked when their feelings were offended. It was Italians of the Renaissance who first taught more polite habits. Books of etiquette began to appear, of which the most successful was Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, 1528. The courtier was ancestor to the gentleman. Courtesy was originally the kind of behavior suited to princely courts. The courtier, according to Castiglione, should be a man of good birth, but is chiefly the product of training. His education in youth and his efforts in mature years should be directed toward mixing agreeably in the company of his equals. His clothes should be neat, his movements graceful, his approach to other people perfectly poised. He must converse with facility, be proficient in sports and arms, 70, and know how to dance and appreciate music. He should know Latin and Greek. With literary and other subjects, he should show a certain familiarity, but never become too engrossed. Pedantry and heaviness must yield to an air of effortless superiority, so that even when the courtier knows or does something seriously, he must treat it lightly as one of many accomplishments. At its best, the code taught a consideration for the feelings of others and incorporated some of the moral ideas of the 171 humanists, aiming at a good and successful life in active society. Castiglione's book was translated into numerous languages, and 100 editions were printed before 1600. The Courtier. This painting by the Italian artist Lavinia Fontana, 1552 to 1614, portrays an appreciation for the generations and social roles that constituted late Renaissance family life. Entitled simply Portrait of a Family, it arranges people by age and gender, thus suggesting a different identity and destiny for each person and each group. Fontana was one of the most prolific and successful women artists of the early modern era, and she conveyed her own knowledge of family life, having 11 children of her own, through her detailed artistic representations of specific individuals and their social relationships. Scala Art Resource, NY. Castiglione's ideal court also included women whose civilizing influence was supposed to encourage the good manners, polite conversation, and cultural graces that rough-edged men might otherwise ignore. Expressing common views of men and women that shaped much of Renaissance culture, Castiglione expected men to cultivate a robust and sturdy manliness, which would be balanced in court society by the soft and delicate tenderness of women. Such distinctions suggested also the gender divisions in Renaissance families and households, including those that were far removed from the courts of princes. 172 Historical Documents. Baldassare Castiglione, The Book of the Courtier, 1528. Renaissance humanists developed new descriptions of good behavior and successful human lives. The following excerpts from Baldassare Castiglione's influential book about how to succeed at a princely court suggest, in typical humanist fashion, that individuals can shape their own reputations and create plans for achieving their goals. To be sure, these goals were more available to men than to women, but could these ideas also be useful for ambitious women? Note how Castiglione advises the would-be courtier to appear nonchalant as he seeks to impress others and gain recognition within a status-conscious social community. I have discovered a universal rule which seems to apply more than any other in all human actions or words, namely, to steer away from affectation at all costs as if it were a rough and dangerous reef, and to practice in all things a certain nonchalance which conceals all artistry and makes whatever one says or does seem uncontrived and effortless. I am sure that grace springs especially from this. So we can truthfully say that true art is what does not seem to be art, and the most important thing is to conceal it, because if it is revealed, this discredits a man completely and ruins his reputation. So this quality, which is the opposite of affectation, and which we are now calling nonchalance, brings with it another advantage, for whatever action it accompanies, not only reveals the skill of the person doing it, but also very often causes it to be considered far greater than it really is. Our courtier, therefore, will be judged to be perfect and will show grace in everything, and especially in his speech, if he shuns affectation. Baldassare Castiglione, The Book of the Courtier, translated by George Bull, London, Penguin Books Limited, 1967, p. 67, 69 to 70. The marriages that created Renaissance households grew out of careful negotiations in which the families of prospective brides and grooms sought to enhance their respective social positions. In Florence, for 173 example, parents typically arranged for their daughters to be married by age 18 to older men whose economic or political connections would be advantageous to the young woman's own family. Florentine husbands, who had usually reached age 30 before their first marriage, were well advanced in trades or professions before they established their new households, which depended also on the dowries that they received through their marriage contracts. The different ages of husbands and wives reinforced the gender divisions in Renaissance families. Men pursued their public careers with their professional peers, while their much younger wives raised children in the home. The high mortality rates in Renaissance cities, however, meant that women often outlived their older husbands, and as young widows, they were forced to raise the children and manage the household. The young men who attended the new Renaissance schools therefore came from families in which mothers usually provided the most important training during their early years. Renaissance education and manners, as taught in the new schools and academies, thus developed within the distinctive patterns of Italian family life and extended the other lessons that women were also teaching at home. Renaissance marriages, 72. Politics in the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, for all its cultural accomplishments, produced no institution or great idea by which masses of people living in society could be held together. Indeed, the greatest of Europe's institutions, the Roman Catholic Church, in which Europeans had lived for centuries, and without which they did not see how they could live at all, fell into neglect under the Renaissance popes. Nor did Italy as a whole develop any effective political institutions. Florence during the 15th century passed from a high spirit of patriotism to acceptance of one man rule. 174. Throughout the peninsula, the merchants, bankers, connoisseurs, and courtly classes who controlled the city states could not fight for themselves, nor arouse their citizens to fight for them. They therefore hired professional fighting men, condottieri, private leaders of armed bands, who contracted with the various city states to carry on warfare, and often raised their price or changed sides during hostilities. Italian politics became a tangled web, a labyrinth of subterfuge and conspiracy, a platform on which powerful individuals might exhibit their virtue. Dictators rose and fell. The Medici became dukes in Florence, the Sforza in Milan, while in Venice and Genoa, where the republics survived, narrow oligarchies held tight control. These states, along with the states of the church, jockeyed for influence within an intricate, shifting, and purely local balance of power. Italy was the despair of its patriots, or of such few as remained. One of these was Niccolò Machiavelli, who, in The Prince, 1513, wrote the most lasting work of the Italian Renaissance. He dreamed of the day when the citizens of his native Florence, or indeed of all Italy, should behave like early Romans, show virility in their politics, fight in citizen armies for patriotic causes, and uphold their dignity before Europe. It was outside Italy, in Kings Ferdinand of Aragon, Louis V of France, and Henry VII of England, that Machiavelli was obliged to find 73 his modern monarchical heroes. He admired them because they knew how to exercise power and how to build strong states. In The Prince, he produced a handbook of statecraft that he hoped Italy might find useful. He produced also the first purely secular treatise on politics. Win 75, Niccolò Machiavelli by Cristofano dell'Altissimo, Italian c. 1525 to 1605. Niccolò Machiavelli's famous book, The Prince, developed a new, secular account of how political rulers gained and consolidated their control of state power. Although his writings were criticized for ignoring Christian ethical values, Machiavelli's ideas marked a key starting point for modern European political thought. Fine art, Getty Images. Machiavelli, medieval writings on politics, those of Thomas Aquinas or Marsiglio of Padua, for example, had always talked of God's will for the government of people, with such accompanying matters as justice and right, or divine and natural law. All this Machiavelli put aside. He emancipated politics from theology and moral philosophy. He undertook to describe simply what rulers actually did. What really happens, said Machiavelli, is that 176 effective rulers and governments use their power to act only in their own political interest. They keep faith or break it, observe treaties, or repudiate them, are merciful or ruthless, forthright or sly, peaceable or aggressive, according to their estimates of their political needs. Machiavelli was prepared to admit that such behavior was bad. He only insisted that it was in this way, however regrettably, that successful rulers behaved. He was thought unduly cynical, even in an age that lacked political delicacy. He had nevertheless diagnosed the new era with considerable insight. It was an age when politics and political theory were in fact breaking off from religion, with the building up of state power and authority emerging as goals that required no other justification. Uses of political power. But the most successful states of the time, as Machiavelli saw, were not in Italy. They were what history knows as the new monarchies, and they owed their strength to something more than princely craft, for they enjoyed a measure of loyalty from the people they governed. The city-states in Renaissance Italy failed to sustain even this limited sense of loyalty between governments and their people. Italian politics became an affair of individual or elite virtue, and, as outsiders began to realize, the people of Italy lost interest in both the politics and the wars of their own city-states. So Italy, the sunny land of balmy Mediterranean skies, rich in the busy life of its cities, Its moneyed wealth, its gorgeous works of art, became vulnerable to the depredations of other more unified peoples from Spain and the north who possessed political and military institutions in which men could act together in large numbers. In a new age of rising national monarchies, the city states of Italy were too small to compete. In 1494, a French army crossed the Alps. Italy became a bone of contention between France and Spain. In 1527, during a later phase of this long conflict, an army of undisciplined Spanish and German mercenaries, joined by footloose Italians, fell upon Rome itself. Never, not even from the barbarian Goths of the 5th century, had Rome experienced anything so 177 horrible and degrading. The city was sacked, thousands were killed, soldiers milled about in an orgy of rape and loot, the Pope was imprisoned, and cardinals were mockingly paraded through the streets, facing backward on the backs of mules. Italian vulnerability. After the sack of Rome, the Italian Renaissance faded away. Politically, for over 300 years, Italy remained divided, the passive object of the ambitions of outside powers. Meanwhile, its culture permeated the rest of Europe.